We continue this morning with a theme that we started with last week as we've been looking at Genesis 1 and this whole record of how God created the world. And as we have been looking at it, we've been seeing pretty clearly that the record of Genesis 1 and a belief in its accuracy means that we have to take a very different view of how this universe came into being than that of evolution. We have come to certain conclusions already, and I hope we'll come to more, that will not only show us that the record of Genesis is incompatible with naturalistic evolution that leaves God really out of the picture, except in some theistic ideas of God somehow starting a big bang into being and letting everything else just play itself out. But we're going to see that God is doing everything he can to reveal himself to us in the way that he has made the universe and made us. Last week we looked at 3 issues related to the Genesis account as we went through chapter 1 that show us these things as far as the incompatibility of this record with naturalistic evolution. We saw the order of creation revealed to us, an order that differs from that is speculated at by those who have come up with other explanations for the world. The pattern of creation that is revealed to us in that first few phrases where it says the earth was without form and void, or it was unformed and unfilled. And so we have this pattern of days 1 through 3, the forming of what God created, and days 4 through 6, the filling of what God has created. And then we've considered the days of creation. And here we looked not only at the order, but specifically the idea that these days as revealed to us ought to be understood as we would naturally read this passage, as literal sun and moon, 24-hour rotation of the earth days. As we've looked at that and considered that, I tried to share with you the views of some Christians, people who love the Lord, but people who have been influenced, I believe, by faulty theology. I went back, and it's interesting to read in the 19th century, watching conservative people who did not have some of the advantages we actually have in the 21st century of science to look at things closely, who, wrestling with the overwhelming evidence of science supposedly in that day, tried to say, well, I suppose we could say this about, Charles Hodge, wonderful scholar at Princeton, wonderful man whose theology in so many ways was good. You watch him struggle and just kind of begin to say, well, I suppose we could say this. And that idea of trying to accommodate has continued to grow among evangelicals, so that some have tried to say the days are days Moses had the revelation, or they're analogical days that yes, they're a day, but who knows how long they're, because they're God's days and not ours, or the days are long ages of time, or the days are actual days, but they take place with long ages in between, or there was an original creation that took lots and lots of time to just sit there, and then God did the 24-hour days. All of those do not flow from this text. And my challenge to those who insist that we should go some other direction is to give me solid textual evidence that we should understand it differently than the way it reads. And the funny thing is, everybody I read, and even the current commentaries, when you press them and they're saying things other than little 24-hour days, they always start with, well, of course, a natural reading of this text would lead one to believe that this took place in 6 24-hour days. And then they spend pages trying to explain why we shouldn't accept the natural reading. I say, if the natural sense makes sense, don't seek another sense. You might wind up with nonsense. The first part of that was from a seminary professor. The last part was mine. So, well. So anyway, we looked at these 3 things. We're going to look at one more of these considerations that seems to fly in the face of naturalistic evolution. And then I want us to consider 3 other things this account reveals to us that really ought to give Christians a whole lot more comfort and rest in this account than sometimes it does. So let's look at this fourth area. It's the first point today, but it's the fourth of these areas that does not link up, does not match up with evolution, and that is this idea of the kinds of creation. Now, we read the whole text last time, and I'm not going to have us read it out loud again, but in Genesis chapter 1, as we start looking at things being made, whether it's plants, sea creatures, birds, animals, this phrase keeps coming up. It's a recurring phrase, and anytime you have a recurring phrase, I always teach students when we're trying to learn how to interpret, if God repeats something over and over again, it's being emphasized. And he says, for example, in verse 11, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees bearing fruit, which is in their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it says in verse 12, the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, each according to their own kinds, trees bearing fruit, which is in their seed, each according to its kind. Did you catch that over and over again? The idea of kind. It says that when the plants brought forth fruit and it had the seed, each plant brought forth the fruit, or tree brought forth the fruit that was according to its kind, and the seed was according to its kind. Each kind reproduced after its own kind, not another. There is no process of one kind becoming another kind, whether you're looking at verse 12, which is vegetation, or verse 21. And by the way, if you look at verse 21, it says, so God created the great sea creatures. Some versions early on said the sea monsters. Well, some people say, oh, it's the whales. Maybe. The Hebrew word is tanin, which is used for Leviathan, which seems to be a seagoing creature that looks nothing, if you look at the description in Job, like a whale. I'm going to suggest to you, and this is, I'm not going to die on this hill, but I'm going to suggest to you that when you see Leviathan, when you see Behemoth, you do not see animals that we see now. Frankly, I think the best understanding of it, but we'd probably get laughed out of school, is dragon. You say, dragon? Yeah. Why is it that every culture, wherever you go, I just talked to somebody this week who saw cave drawings in Canada. You go to China, you go to Africa, you go to India, you go back into their history, and all of them tell stories about these giant lizards, some of which flew, some of which were fire-breathing. And you say, oh, that's crazy. Well, we don't have any fire-breathing dragons. We do have a fire-expelling beetle today, the bombardier beetle. I don't know. Maybe these are some sort of dinosaur. I'm not saying they have to be fire-breathing. It doesn't say fire-breathing sea creatures. It just says sea creatures. Could there have been things God created that we don't see today? Well, we all agree that there are animals that are now extinct. So when it talks about sea creatures, it could include all sorts, because then it says, and every living creature that moves. Now that's a different word. Living creature that moves is the same idea of nefesh chaya, that wonderful word I shared with you last week. Living souls, that probably applies to whales and dolphins and other mammalian-type creatures that are in the sea. And it says, with which the waters swarm, again, according to their kinds. And then birds, according to their kind, verses 24 and 25. It says, living creatures after their kind. By the way, living creatures according to their kind. It says, livestock, creeping things, beasts of the earth. That's three categories that the Hebrew maintains pretty well. Livestock, that's domesticated animals. And then it says, creeping things, well, you kind of know what those are. Lizards and other such things. And then beasts of the earth. What are the beasts of the earth as opposed to livestock? Non-domesticated animals. Now the point here is that God created sea creatures and he created land creatures in the same way. He created them. He didn't turn a whale into an elephant. He didn't take one kind and create another. We have multiplication of the kinds. Now, notice I've been trying to make sure to say naturalistic evolution in terms of saying what we reject. We're not saying that there is no, quote, evolution, small e, evolving of animals' types within their kind. We've seen that in our day with all the different kinds of breeds of dog, how dogs are being bred and new breeds are sometimes being announced and being treated as new breeds. So far, they have not called the Pekingese poodle the peekapoo, a breed, I don't think. But, I mean, I went to a pet store recently. I saw all sorts of dog breeds, listed, and I'm going, I have never heard of that. Well, what happens? Animals with similar characteristics breeding together over time produce uniquenesses. But the idea is that within a kind, there can be interbreeding and there can be the development of new types of animals, even, dare I say it, natural selection. That is, in certain areas where the climate and conditions are good, certain types of these animals thrive and certain types don't. They die out. We don't object to that. What we object to is the idea of one kind becoming another kind. The Bible doesn't allow for that. What we know of the differentiation within kinds accounts, we believe, for all the diversity that we see in the creation today. Because God, in creating those initial kinds, placed within them a gene pool, a strand of DNA with all of the information that would account for all the different kinds. We certainly have to argue for that when we consider the differences in humans, all descended from the original pair. Now, those four ideas that we've talked about, the three last week and then this idea of kind, the Bible insists by saying over and over and over and over again, it's this way, means you have to decide, will I accept the record that the Scripture gives us, or will I accept another idea, an idea that actually stems from, in some cases, an absolute rejection of God and a desire to find any way to explain things other than by Him. And you know what? That just keeps breaking. I read 2 articles this week where scientists commenting on recent developments, one in microbiology, one in astrophysics, and talking about planets and how we just can't find any place in the universe where life could possibly exist like it does here. And a scientist commenting on that said, it's almost uncanny that our planet is right where it is in its solar system, in relationship to other planets, in relationship to our galaxy, in relationship to the universe. Or one looking in microbiology at the infinite complexity seemingly that we find every time we look further and further. I know it's not infinite because God created it's finite, but the complexity that we find in creation, saying, if you didn't know better, you'd assume someone designed this. We must believe one or the other. But you know, where we as believers who accept that our God is in the heavens and does whatever He pleases, have plenty of evidence in this text to remind us of that. For example, you need to read Genesis 1 and see the power behind creation. You have a phrase from the very beginning of the creation record as things are being formed and filled that is so important to us. It says, and God said. Creation accomplished by a spoken word. And God said, verse 3. And God said, verse 6. And God said, verse 9, verse 11, verse 14, verse 20.